Okay, so the way this is going to work is that there'll be homework assignments like every week, more or less, right? And those will be things. There'll be problems where you'll be given some sentences and with challenges in them in terms of how they could be analyzed, or sets of data from English usually, but from also possibly from other languages. And then they'll be posted on SmartSite and sent around as with an email announcement, so you know where to go get them. And then the general procedure will be that they'll be due on Monday night. I think that's what we're thinking. And then you'll have a discussion section on Fridays with the TA. Kristen over here, by the way, Kristen is your TA. And the idea here is that she's going to be able to go over the homework, explain things to you, help out a little bit with that, give you some guidance. She's done this a lot. This is what she does for a living, is figure out problems in languages in terms of their syntax and their semantics. So that's the basic idea. Now I think it's fine if you work with other people on this, right? You get the assignment. Kristen's going to be talking with you about it. People are going to be discussing it. It's got to be a little bit challenging. Otherwise, it would be kind of dumb, right? But, you can work on it with each other. And then the critical thing, however, is that you write your own answers. That's the main thing. You can't just go, okay, here's my answers, and somebody copies it, right? I mean, obviously, you can find ways to cheat, but, don't cheat. Okay. No section meeting this week because there won't be any homework until the following week. All right? Yeah. The link for Linguistics 231 is the same thing, right? No, there'll be a way of doing that. I'll correct those. And as far as discussion section goes for 231, you guys are, graduate students get together with each other and work things out, right? And if you have run into problems, you let me know. If you want to attend one of the discussion sections that's being held on Friday, I don't have any problem with that, as long as I don't see any problem with that. Does that make sense? Okay. So what we need to do in order to have an analysis of sentences is to have some kind of understanding of the words, because we know that the rules for putting sentences together have to do with categorizing words and then stating what order and in what combinations words can go together. So the basic system is one in which words go together to make phrases. And just like inside of the word, for those of you who have taken a class on morphology or 103B, where you study the internal structure of words, there are morphemes, there are rules for how you put them together. The same thing applies at the sentence level. We're going to have to be looking at the morphemes because that will be relevant to how you put them together. But the syntax is mostly about the categories that words belong to and how you build the phrases out of the individual words. So I'm going to actually start out with giving fairly detailed representations of what things might look like in a theory of grammar. And there are different theories. I'll come back to this issue. There are lots of ways of doing this, but they all share common properties. Well, not all. Most of them share basic assumptions that are similar to what we're going to be looking at now. So one of the assumptions is that there's something called a lexicon, where lexicon means the mental dictionary that people carry around with. It's a list of all of the words and morphemes. Not just the words, but the morphemes and everything, right? And there will be meanings associated with them. That's what we have to know. In order to know another language, you need to know the vocabulary. You need to know what the words mean. And you also need to know how they can combine with other words. That's the syntax part of it all. So we assume that there's something that we could call a lexical entry. That is a store of the information about words and morphemes that we carry around with us. and that makes it possible for us to put everything together. So this is one kind of structure that you could use to represent the meaning. This kind of structure actually comes from theories in which there's an attempt to have a lexicon with lexical entries that have sufficient structure in them that a computer could use them in order to build sentences. That's sort of is the idea here. So it's going to be schematic in some sense. It's going to be the skeleton of the information that you need in order to do things. So there's this is called an attribute value matrix or a feature matrix. There's different terminology that's used for this. Matrix means it's like that box there where you have all of this information. And attribute value, there are attributes and values for them. So there's a phonological attribute and it has a value. There's a meaning value, or a meaning attribute, and it has a value, and so forth. So there's going to be, the key thing that we have to have is a meaning and the sounds that are associated with that. But we need more. So we know there's going to be a representation of the phonemes. Then from that representation, the phonological rules can apply, and that's one part of the processing that goes on. And then we're gonna also have the meaning, and that's going to be in these kinds of matrices. The meaning will be abbreviated in some sense, because the meaning of boy has to do with a concept that is a rich concept and needs to be spelled out with some detail, but kind of, we all know what boy means, right? And that would be something that would be available in at least most languages, and so it's a fairly common thing. And in order to define this in a perfect, first of all, it's difficult. There aren't theories that most theories don't go very far in defining things like this. Boy, everyone just thinks, well, everybody knows what boy means, right? But then what they do, their tendency is to go and say, well, everybody knows what idea means, and everyone knows what happiness means, and so they don't bother to define anything because it means whatever they mean, right? So we'll be using that trick as well, because what else are you going to do, right? Not always, but in lots of cases. And then there's the syntax part of it. So what is it that's relevant about this word in terms of where it can go in a sentence and all of that. So the syntax component then can have within it an embedded, or typically would have within it, an embedded matrix where there would be attributes, each of which would have a different value. So there would be things like number and person, and depending on the language you're looking at, there could be the case that it's in, whether it's nominative, accusative, that kind of thing, depending on the language you're looking at. For English, you don't really need a lot there, but you're going to need the category, and number is going to be important here too, because this is going to be boy in the plural form, and that's going to be relevant to where you can put it in sentences and what it can combine with. So that's all part of the, at least on one take of what the lexicon would consist of. The take that I'm taking right now, at least, is that whole words are part of our lexical, or part of our lexicon. So even though we know there's a rule that says you can take boy and put it together with z to make the plural, it's also probably the case that we store plural forms whole in the lexicon as well. We know we have to do that with some of them. Things like things that don't have a regular rule that applies to them, right? Mouse and mice. Mice is the plural form of mouse. Mouse is the singular form. So there's no harm in saying that these are lexical entries. Although we probably, like I said, have an underlying morphological rule that yields this as an automatic consequence. All right, so then we have also the other words there. Kissed would have a phonological structure. It would have a meaning. Category would be verb. So N for noun, V for verb. It's also in the past tense form. It would have other forms. The past participial form could be listed in the lexicon with exactly the same, in this case, exactly the same phonological representation. And here we don't need to say anything about the nature of the subject because past tense verbs don't care, right? They don't care whether it's singular or plural or first person or second person, anything like that, right? So we're just putting what we need there. And then here with verbs, we're going to want to have a more elaborate representation of the meaning somehow or other. And different theories do this in different ways. How many of you took 103B last quarter? So you learned about a system for representing the meanings of sentences and words, right? A formula, a kind of logic formula that had, isn't that right? Where you have things like do, and did you guys go through that, right? It was okay, do, cause, and all of those kinds of things. So here, one way of doing it, another way of doing it is to just really focus on the what's sometimes called the argument structure. Even in that theory that you were looking at, when they get to real problems of meaning, they unleash that whole system and use lots of things that you wouldn't see in a kind of in the course that you took. It's going to be a fairly skeletal representation of the meaning. And the most skeletal you could get would be something like this, where you don't even bother to really say what kiss means, right? Because all you really care about at some level for the syntax is that there's a doer of the action, right? So the first argument of do / whatever, right, in role and reference grammar. And there's a thing that is acted upon, typically the undergoer in role and reference grammar. So agent and patient are the most common words to designate those basic roles. So that's what we have here. But then we know that underlying this, we could represent the meaning in a more more explicit fashion. And the role and reference grammar type logical, what do they call it? Logical structure. I know that when these guys got to real problems, they went to at points. They went to Wierzbicka and they said, well, we have to give more of the meaning. We would do something like this. We can unpack that formula that we use. So there's some meaning there. We're not going to be really concerned about that for the most part, right? What exactly the meaning of kiss is, because like I said, all we really need to know for the syntax generally is that, well, I'm not sure how much you need to know, but the most important thing is that there's an agent and a patient. It has two arguments, two things that have to be instantiated in there. And then we have which would be a category determiner. And now here, what I think we need to do is to introduce a new kind of syntactic feature called complement, because there are certain words that, well, I did that with, didn't I do that with KISS? There was a complement feature. Can't remember. But there should be that one there too, because maybe I didn't put it there, because you don't, at some level you don't need it. But here we need to say that requires that there be a noun. That's its very nature, right? It's no good without that. So the complements would be things that are there because they're required. Ultimately by the meaning, but also by, you could represent that meaning requirement in terms of one of these kinds of syntactic features. So, and then there would be a meaning. We would just say indefinite, right? And actually is ambiguous, right? It could have different meanings. Not ambiguous isn't the right word, but polysemous. It can sometimes mean one or another, something like that, right? At other times it means specific thing that I have in mind, but that has this other, there's something that exists, and I think that you're not already thinking about it now. Therefore, I won't use the, because I have to make a choice, right? Am I going to use the, or am I going to use a? And there's something like that going on there. And then we could say that we could represent that the in the meaning, we could say that there's a variable of some kind, right? Like X and Y, like you do with kiss. And then that variable can, within the meaning, bind to different parts of the thing, right? So the thing that we're talking about is X. That corresponds to the noun. There's a correspondence between something in the meaning and something in the syntax, and therefore in something in this feature attribute matrix. Okay, so we have lexical entries and have information about what words are, what they mean, what they're, in some cases, what complements they have, and often that's something that's derivable from the meaning. And they have categories. That's an important thing, right? Syntactic categories: determiner, noun, verb, and so forth, right? I don't think they use determiner very much in role and reference grammar. Did you come across this in 103B, those who took that last quarter? Did you ever come across this before, this word? Yeah. Articles are one type of larger class of things that we call determiner. So determiner that's sort of a, it's something that syntacticians made up in, the 60s. And because they knew that the and these and those and a variety of different things all shared the property of going at the beginning of noun phrases, basically. And so therefore, at some level, they should be treated as a unified class. That's the sort of general thinking that is used. If things behave alike, then they are the same thing at some level. But because we say and the are determiners, we can also say that they're the kind of determiner that you would call articles, right? Definite and indefinite articles. But there are other things. There are demonstrative determiners. There are possessive determiners like my and your and his, those kinds of things. Those are all in the same class in terms of at least a large set of their syntactic properties. They have different meanings. Their meaning values are quite different. So that's the idea behind the category determiner. You could do without it by just labeling all of the individual subclasses. But then you would need a larger set of rules for how you put things together. By collapsing all those things into one category, we can capture in our grammar what they share, and we can state the rules fairly simply. Okay, so that's the basic idea. There's words, they belong to categories. That's all part of our lexical knowledge, part of the lexicon. That doesn't mean, by the way, notice that, like I talked about last time, it doesn't mean that these words all have to be of these categories only. Any given phonological form can have more than one category associated with it under the right circumstances. Right? So that's not to say that, in fact, boys, I guess, has to be a noun, because at least as much as that's the plural morpheme there, because the plural morpheme goes on nouns only, right? So there's a kind of definitional thing by virtue of that. But we have words put into categories, and then we have phrase structure rules is the basic idea. And the phrase structure rules tell you how to put those words together into larger phrases. So there would be a rule saying that noun phrases, so we read these rules like this. NP means noun phrase, N for noun, P for phrase. Noun phrases consist of, the arrow could be read as meaning that. Noun phrases consist of, and then we say what the pieces are that they consist of, and the order in which they must go is specified in the rule iconically. So this is saying in this version of phrase structure grammar, this is saying a noun phrase consists of a determiner followed by a noun phrase. Fairly simple, right? So therefore we can build the noun phrase of frog by putting because it's a determiner, together with frog. And we can do the same thing to put the and boys together, and we get another noun phrase. So we've taken care of two pieces of the structure here. We've got two phrases, and we know that they're the same kind of phrase, right? We have they would go into any place in a syntactic structure where you need a noun phrase. These would generally both work, right? Because they're of the same category. Noun phrase is a particular category of the syntax. And then we have another rule that says, oh, well, kissed in a frog, and we'll go through why we want to do this. I'm not going to do this right now, but there's lots of evidence for saying that kissed goes together with a frog rather than that kissed goes together with the boys. Because verb phrases will behave in with certain patterns. They'll follow certain patterns in their behavior. And they're distinguished from other things by those patterns. And then we have another rule that says, okay, now put those all together and we get our clause. So this is really a very, very basic phrase structure grammar, the kind that Noam Chomsky was looking at and devised back in the 1950s when, I mean, his was not exactly like this, but, it's all right. The idea that there were verb phrases was there for sure, and that what we're building mostly is clauses or S's, so S for sentence or clause. All right? Now, then we can relate the lexical entry with the syntactic structure by virtue of our knowledge of what the correspondences generally are. So there would be, you could say that there are correspondence rules that have to do with how you interpret the noun phrases. So the question is, so if we say, okay, the boys kissed a frog is a legitimate structure. But we also have to get not only that that's a legitimate structure because determiner and noun go together, but we also have to get the right interpretation. We have to know who it is that did the kissing and who it was that got kissed, right? And that's information that would be part of the meaning. That is, there are two roles in the meaning, an agent role and a patient role. The one doing the action and the thing that undergoes it or receives the action of so agent and patient roles. And those are, there's a general correspondence there. The noun phrase that we call subject, so we use the term subject often to refer to the noun phrase that's higher up, outside of the VP, the one that comes first. English is a language that puts subject, verb, and then object, right? Other languages do it in other ways, but most languages will have some kind of a configuration that encodes that distinction. Not all languages do. Some languages do it not with phrase structure, but with other devices, right? So this is pretty simple so far, right? There's a subject slot, there's an object slot. The object corresponds to the patient. In general, just really schematically, the subject corresponds to the agent, right? And so here we have a feature structure or attribute value matrix. We can account for the interpretation that we get. We can account for the differences in grammaticality between different sentences just with what we have so far, right? We have to have the whatever features there are associated with a word have to be obeyed by the syntactic structure and by the combinations that we put. And we have to obey the phrase structure rules. So boy, frog, kiss is not okay given this set of rules because of what? The word order is not a problem, actually, right? If somebody said, boy, frog, kiss, you would assume that the kisser was the boy, right? But you'd be going, whoa, hold on, dude. Yeah, that's not a sentence of English. Why? Because it's missing the grammatical glue. It's missing the stuff that we require. All that stuff that you have to learn as a second language learner. You might come from a language that doesn't have any of that. They might have languages. There are languages that have other grammatical glue, stuff of other kinds, but in a sentence like this, they might have nothing but 3 words like that. That's a possibility. So, but for English, that's going to be in all varieties, as far as I know, ungrammatical, because it's missing the stuff that you need. The kissed boy's frog just doesn't follow the phrase structure rules at all, right? And the boy frog kiss also doesn't, right? Because these phrase structure rules say the only possibilities for a noun phrase are determiner and noun. If you're missing the determiner, forget it. And this is not the right rule, obviously, but the rule is more complicated than that because you don't always need determiners. But in this case, you do. And the kissed boy's frog has all of the pieces, but they're distributed in a way that doesn't follow the phrase structure. How would you know whether the goes with frog or boys? And well, you know that actually you could figure it out, right? If the rules were for every article, there has to be a corresponding noun somewhere. Possible rule, right? There are actually cases like this. There are languages that actually allow you to do this kind of thing. Where they don't care. I don't think it works with articles, but demonstratives, for example. There are languages in Australia where you can put the demonstrative out on the left and the noun is way over there on the right, but they each have a marker on them, a morpheme on them, that tells you to match them up. You don't have to match them up with the syntax, right? There are different ways of doing these things. But in English, you can't do that, and the phrase structure rules account for it. The boy kisses a frog is going to be bad. For what reason? The syntactic properties of all words must be consistent with the overall structure. So that's just a very general constraint. And the problem here is that one part of the verb kisses is going to, unlike kiss, now right, notice kisses has another part of the syntactic feature structure. It's going to have the attribute subject, and it's going to say, my subject has to be third singular. If I'm a present tense verb, and I have and I have the z morpheme on me, then I'm going to have a third person singular subject. And the problem here is that boys is plural. It's third person, plural. So that's the reason for the ungrammaticality. So notice it's not just, that's why you have to have more than just the phrase structure rules for syntax, right? You have to be able to see the grammatical morphemes and how they correspond to the meaning that you're trying to get. And there has to be a match there. Right? It's pretty easy so far, right? I mean, I know there's lots of drawings. Some you don't have to really worry about that too much. I'm not really going to be caring about these feature attribute structures. But it's good to know that they exist and they account for part of the grammar. And that we can have a fairly elaborate representation of it. Here, the boy kisses frogs is bad because now here we have to go and look at I'm starting to maybe abbreviate things more and more here, right? So instead of saying complements because it's too long to write out, we say comps. That means I can have complements, maybe more than one, depending on what kind of word I am. And part of our knowledge about these things is that if I'm a word that requires complements, then they better be there. So here, in the case of it requires that there be a singular noun after it. And it's the clash here with the plural form of the noun frogs is the problem. It's not a problem with the phrase structure. It's not a problem with the correspondence rules. It's a problem with the grammatical constraint having to do with the morphology. Okay, so that's the basic kind of system that we're looking at. It has those kinds of elements in it. There's a lexicon with information about the meanings of words and about things that they inherently must or cannot combine with, together with rules for putting words together into structures. Now, what I want to, I just want to warn you that we have to think of these things as being stories or hypotheses rather than facts. It's just wrong to think of any of this stuff as facts about language. You can't, because there are different ways of presenting the facts. That is to say, the things in the theory, the things in the representations, to say that there are noun phrases is a hypothesis. That's not a fact about the world. There are it reflects certain facts about the way things can combine and all of that. But it would be wrong to recognize that as being something other than a story at some level. And then the other thing is that, or another thing is that all of the stories that we have about the syntax of languages, no matter which one you pick, they're all going to be incomplete to some extent. None of them that I know of, I haven't seen a theory of syntax that accounts for everything. They all go wrong somewhere or other. They all have assumptions that are limiting and that don't allow us to account for all of the facts. The idea that words belong to certain categories. There's a category noun, there's a category preposition, verb, and so forth, and that all words are either in one of those categories or not. That has been known, it's been known for a long time that that's problematic. There are kinds of words that are, the person that first started looking at this was a student of Noam Chomsky's in the 1960s, really a brilliant student that discovered lots of things about language. But he wrote a paper once that he called nouniness, where he said, well, it's a squishy category. And he had a thing that he called squish. And he pointed out that there are lots of words that are kind of sort of nouns, but not all the way nouns. But this theory, the way it's developed and what you're going to be seeing in this class, keeps the assumption that words belong to a certain small set of syntactic categories and they're either in them or out of them. And you can't be part of them and so forth. And so, you just keep it in mind that we're playing a game here. That's all we've ever been doing. Syntacticians are playing a game. How can we give a model for what's happening in language? We look at language and we see it's very interesting. We see it's complex. We see that there are patterns that repeat themselves. We see that we can characterize most of what we see there in terms of rules and representations of the kind that we're looking at. And so we play the game and we take it as far as we can and we see what we can get from it. So, a fact would be that human beings have hearts. And it's some kind of a structure that, this more or less at least a fact, right? At some level, this is a theory of the human anatomy, but it's one that is based on very, very solid empirical evidence, right? You can take a heart out and you can see that it beats, and doctors can cut you open and look at it, and they know that blood flows more or less depending on how the heart pumps and all of that, right? So that would be a fact, but there are lots of things in science and elsewhere that are just stories, right? That are theories, that are hypotheses. If we look at of how the world began, how the universe began, we know just from our lifetimes that it's got to be a story at some level, right? Because, at one point everybody would say, well, there's a Big Bang, right? And they said, well, what was that? And then they started thinking about it and said, well, what on earth could have caused a Big Bang? And then the astrophysicists came up with an even more elaborate story based on scientific evidence, right? They're looking at the facts as they can see them through instruments that look at the sky. And they're trying to reconstruct what must have happened. I don't know how long ago was it that it was supposed to happen. Can't even remember, but it probably says on there somewhere, but, like forever ago. And one of the stories that they come up with is that there was actually, how come there was a Big Bang? Because there was a big splat. there was a parallel universe that was operating in some dimension that we can't see. Something happened in it such that some of the matter and energy got dispersed, and that was the Big Bang in the new universe. But yeah, I don't think you could say that's a fact, right? And syntactic theories are not even probably that good in terms of what they are. And then, other kinds of stories of the beginning of the world would be things like this, and you find this in culture after culture, where maybe some kinds of, typically it's like this, there are beings that are supernatural, and they're kind of like us. And they did things such that the world started, right? There's a God. Think about the Christian religion, right? God is a kind of human-like thing, right? And he said, let there be light, and so forth, right? So those things are what you would characterize, I mean, maybe not, maybe it wouldn't, it depends on your belief system, but, you would, from a scientific perspective, you can sort of see that there's a range of different things that you could have. And then you can have things that are just dubious beliefs, like Splenda causes cancer. Is that, my wife believes this. Why? Because she doesn't want to get cancer. And because whatever anybody says could cause cancer, I better watch out for it. But it's based on a kind of reasoning that people do. Splenda is chemically different than NutraSweet, for those of you who don't know that. It's sucralose, right? But NutraSweet, Splenda and NutraSweet are kind of the same thing. They're artificial sweeteners, and like saccharin, which we know causes cancer. So if Splenda is like saccharin, and we know that saccharin causes cancer, then Splenda must cause cancer. That's a sort of kind of reasoning process that people can use. But then we don't even know that saccharin does. All we know is that they did one study, apparently, in 19... I might not have the facts straight, but some rats got bladder cancer after they received just humongous doses of the stuff. And they didn't even try doing it with powder or something, right? And then coffee causes cancer, cell phones cause cancer. This is a good one, right? I mean, my wife is on this one now. And I had people, really smart people that were over at our house the other night, right? A professor at some university, I won't say where, who was saying, yeah, I've heard, yeah, I think it does too, right? But, there's some kind of X-ray thing or something or other that comes out of it, but it's not the same kind that they know causes cancer. It's a different kind of wave, right, of some kind. And so, I think these things are all, until there's some kind of proof. English is deteriorating because everybody's texting all the time. The language is going to go to hell. There's lots of beliefs about language, right? A lot of them are just dubious. Language causes cancer. There you go. Texting causes cancer, and actually texting because of the cell phone, right? You shouldn't end a sentence with a preposition and all kinds of. Okay, so let's look at a story to illustrate why we need to be always cautious about the extent to which we're talking about facts and the extent to which we're talking about stories. So this I would call the NP story that I just presented it to you and you said, yeah, that sounds right to me. And it was as far as I know, it was probably had some, there were precedents elsewhere in the world of linguistics before Chomsky came along. But he popularized this particular story, and he said, well, okay, we've got things like determiners. Remember I said there are different things that can go in that determiner category. The and some, those, your, these. Exactly what you're going to put in that category isn't entirely clear, by the way. But, and different people will put different things there. And it's actually that in and of itself, what is that category of things that can start noun phrases? What does it consist of? And how do you characterize all of that? That in and of itself we could spend the whole quarter on. It's a very interesting and complex phenomenon. But in any case, determiners, there are adjectives, another kind of thing. And we know that they kind of all behave alike. There are nouns. And there is an assumption in the whole way that this stuff is done that phrases will have a head or a central or key piece. A noun phrase is built around a noun. And the other things, and this rule from Chomsky, 1957, Chomsky, 1957 was the book Syntactic Structures, which put him on the map in the world of linguistics and elsewhere because of the whole new way that he brought to the game, a whole new way of looking at language structure. And so this comes from him. Determiner, and the parentheses now in the phrase structure rules mean what? Optional. So a noun phrase has to have a noun, but it can have the determiner and adjective are optional. We know that the adjective has to be optional, right? Because you can just say the boy. You don't have to say the good boy, right? You don't have to put it. Give me a case where you don't have to have a determiner. Number? Like, give me a sentence with the word number in it that you don't have a... Say it again? 2 texts? I don't know. 2 texts.
2 dogs.
2 dogs.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. 2 would be... Let's come back to that. Is that an adjective or a determiner? 2 dogs. Oh, you were saying numbers in general. Okay, no, but what I'm asking is, we'll come back to numbers, but you could give me a noun phrase without dogs like cats, right? So as long as the noun is what? What's the rule? If the noun is, it's not like you can do it anytime. Yeah, then when can a noun stand alone in a sentence and make a noun phrase all by itself? When it's plural? Huh? Proper nouns, names, right? Pronouns if they're nouns, you, right? If they're nouns. And also mass nouns, right? So I like money, water, and so forth, right? Those are nouns, they're not plural, but they're what we call mass nouns, right? So there's a set of circumstances under which determiners are not needed. And this rule says, okay, you don't need determiners, so you'd have to have other parts of the grammar that would force them in certain cases, right? But you can see it's already going to be a problem because you can't say that nouns, I guess you could say that non-plural or mass nouns require a determiner, or something like that, right? Okay. And then you get things like these little children, like the movie. These children is no good because, why? Because the adjective comes before the determiner. So that's one of the ways we know that determiners are different from adjectives. They come before them, at least usually. Children, these little is no good because the noun can't come first, it has to come last. And these children like the movie is fine because you don't need an adjective. And children like the movie is fine as well because you don't need a determiner, right? So we have a grammar that can account for lots and lots of things already, given this. But there's another way of looking at it that we can call the DP story. And here what we're going to do is say, well, why do we call it DET, determiner, for the determiner? Why don't we go, why don't we abbreviate it all the way to D? Like we do with noun and verb and adjective and so forth, right? So let's do that. We'll just, because it will look better when we make the tree. Basically, that's what they must have had in mind, right? Because at that point in time when this happened, this is 1987, it's pretty far along, right? Although the basic idea had been proposed earlier, it really gets picked up on at this point when Abney, I don't even remember his first name, whereas Stephen Abney, he was a student of Chomsky's at MIT. A lot of the work on syntax, and particularly the model that we're looking at, came out of MIT students studying with Noam Chomsky and his colleagues. at MIT. Probably with some prodding from Chomsky, Abney goes off on the direction that had been suggested earlier, I believe, by one of the faculty members at MIT, Paul Postal, and some other people probably. Let's take this up and work it out. And so he says, okay, we're going to assume that just like as before, we're going to adopt here the endocentricity constraint on phrase structure, that every phrase has a head. That's the basic idea. But let's say that there's a DP, a determiner phrase, and the head of it is a D, a determiner. And then, so the head of the overall thing is going to be the determiner, not the noun. But embedded within that, there'll be an actual noun phrase. And the noun phrase won't have any determiners in it. It will only have other things, like adjectives, together with the noun. All right, you can get the idea, right? It's not it might be disturbing because it's another way of looking at it, right? But that's what we have to do, right? If you don't make any progress in science, if you don't entertain alternative hypotheses and explore them and see what good they can do. Okay, so here, that's the basic idea. There's some evidence for this because we can do things like, I don't like these, but it doesn't have a noun. But we know it, but where does that thing go? If I say I don't like these, it goes in the same slots and sentences that what we think of as noun phrases go. Therefore, it's either a noun phrase. By our basic assumption is, if you behave like something, then you are in the same category with it. And it's very clear that there's a class of things in language, in the English language, that can be characterized as a single class. And that would be lots of evidence, the things that pronouns can substitute for in sentences, for example. The things that can go in the subject slot are noun phrase type things, right? So since this can go in the object slot of a sentence, I don't like requires a noun phrase, and these can go there all by itself, then it's a noun phrase, right? That's the logic. But how is it a noun phrase if it doesn't have a noun in it, is the problem, right? And this story accounts for that, right? Because it doesn't say that a noun phrase has to have, a DP doesn't have to have a noun. It could be just like this, right? The phrase that is of type DP. And it's complete all in and of itself. It doesn't need anything else. So these would have a feature matrix of this kind, feature structure of this kind. And it would have a number value plural, because it counts as plural all by itself, right? And it would require that its noun, the noun phrase that goes with it, also has to be plural, because that's the nature of it, right? The noun phrase that goes with it would have the feature structure of the noun, because that's its head. And so these requires a noun phrase with a plural noun. That would be part of its nature. And it itself would also be plural. So it can occur in a structure like this all by itself. So this is a determiner that, unlike and the, doesn't require a DP. That's all you have to say, right? It has an optional complement. If it has a complement, it has to be plural, but it doesn't have to have one. This would be a demonstrative determiner. All right, so this actually kind of makes some sense, doesn't it? And so you could run with that a little bit, but then you have a problem. How do you account for I don't like dogs? How do you account for I? I is a noun phrase of some kind, right? What kind of a category does I belong to? Is it a noun? If your story says all phrases, everything that goes in the subject slot is a phrase, all phrases have to be of the same category as their head. The head of the pronoun, the word the phrase that has I as at its base, right? What category does I belong to? What would you say? You had to make a choice. The only things you have are determiner, noun, adjective, verb, preposition. I, you, he, she, what do they belong to? Noun, that's what most people would say, right? Okay. So how do you deal with those kinds of things, right? That's a problem that we have with this story. So one thing we could do would be to give up that assumption, right? Give up the endocentricity constraint. We could say, oh, noun phrases don't have to have a noun in them. And that's what some people do. That's what, in fact, there's a paper by the inventor of role and reference grammar, Robert Van Valen, where he says, we don't need that. It's not even part of the theory of grammar. It isn't even true. There are lots of cases in languages where you find things that count as noun phrases that have no noun, that don't have any determiner either, that have all kinds of different things. So that would be a simple solution in a way, but there's another one, and this is the one that people in this theory, this general theoretical framework, usually appeal to. It's the one that Abney appealed to. He said, well, you know what, you can have, they're all DPs, that's all you ever have, but the DPs can have empty Ds, null Ds, Ds that have no phonological content. And so you can do this, right? You can say, here we go. We've got a complete determiner phrase. Determiner phrases are what we commonly think of as noun phrases. They follow the rules. We can keep our assumption, but we must have then one way of doing it. Say, well, there's a phonologically empty unit that has all of those features, those attributes and values. But the phonological part of it is just empty. And then if we do that, we can keep the assumptions that we want. See, this is how people go about solving problems. They say, well, we have some basic assumptions, and they seem like they're mostly right. When we come across facts that appear to invalidate those assumptions, we have two choices, right? We can change our theory to accommodate the facts, or we can change the facts in some way and keep our assumptions, right? We can give ourselves a different story, because notice that what we're dealing with here is stories, right? And we're making them up. These aren't observable things. You can't go out and see, oh, yes, we can see, we put it under a microscope, it's a noun. Our knowledge about what categories things belong to is all based on indirect evidence. So that's what we could do, right? Or we could go back to the NP story and say, well, how do we count for these? I don't like these. If you're a noun phrase and these is a determiner, how does that fit into the structure? Given that assumption that every phrase has a head, what could we do? Same thing. Get rid of that assumption. Right? And then we're okay. But we've gotten rid of assumption that we might want, but that we might want to keep, because it does explain things in language. So then we could do it like this, right? We have the opposite solution for a different problem. We could say, well, there are empty nouns, right? Well, there's a head. There's a head, because the head says, got to have a noun. But if we allow ourselves the option of having empty nouns, just like we did with the determiners, then we solve the problem in a different way. But you could do it, there's a number of ways that you could do it is the key thing. So we would have it would look like this. We save all of our assumptions. We have an empty thing that means ones, or one, right? And in fact, this is the way languages work with this, right? English is kind of weird, actually, at having a pronominal thing one. So I want the big one. One goes in there, right? You can't say, I want the big, right? I've seen 2 things, 3 things, and say, I want the big. No, you have to say, I want the big one, right? Lots of languages wouldn't do that. What would they do? They would say, I want the big. That would be the end of the story, right? So that's sort of what the facts are about language, right? there are these cases where English puts in one, obeying that idea we have that there has to be a noun. One would count as the noun. But lots of other languages put nothing there. So how do we account for that? We could say one of two things. English has the right. It gives the evidence for the right structure. And all of those other languages have empty one. Right? Don't laugh. That's what people have been willing to do, right, in order to keep their cherished assumptions, right? Another way of looking at this is that that there is another thing that you could do. So we know that we can do things like this. I like those books, but I don't like these books. Would we ordinarily say something like that? Yeah, maybe you could do this to be grammatical, right? I see two stacks of books, and I go, well, which ones do you like? I like these books, but I don't like what would I ordinarily do? Those. But I could say that, well, what I really have is this. I like those books, but I don't like these books. But then I have a rule that says, oh, you know what? Since those are the same, I'm just going to leave that one off, and we call it noun ellipsis, right? There's a rule that says you can have nouns in a sentence, but you cannot pronounce them. That's sort of the same thing as saying there's an empty noun, but it's a little bit different, right? And this was a process that was appealed to widely in early versions of this theory, where there were ellipse rules everywhere. We'll come back to that, yeah.
Has anyone proposed the notion of posts?
What?
Posts?
Sure.
Would mean I don't like. Sorry.
Right. Right.
Or actually there.
It's this.
Speaker.
Yeah. It's in your mind.
Yeah.
But because you've already got it in the mind, right? Because you've said it.
I just mean it does.
Yeah.
You don't have to say it earlier. Because of not.
Oh, right. So it wouldn't even be a syntactic rule.
Exactly.
But simply, yeah, sure. So that's one way. I don't think that it was done with this, but you know, you never. What got swept into that hypothetical category that no one ever proved existed, right? Was all kinds of things that didn't want to be dealt with, right? But yeah, that would be another way of doing it, right? Okay. So again, we can get what we want, and everything is cool. But there are other ways of doing it. So I'm just giving you the stories that I know. The ones that we've looked at, people have already tried. I'm sorry, what you were saying, there is a theory called simpler syntax, which would use what you were saying, basically. They were saying, well, whatever you say, that's what's there. But there's also stuff in the mind, and it's part of the meaning, and you could do all kinds of operations there, including ones that allow you to have missing parts of the syntax, right? That's sort of what you're saying, right? So here's someone else that comes along and says, well, you know what? Those things that you call determiners aren't even determiners. We're going to call them pronouns. And we're going to say that pronouns and nouns belong to the same kind of category. They're similar categories, right? And that's why they can be used in the ways that they are. And so every phrase is built around a word of a like category. Not necessarily the same one. It doesn't have to be isomorphic with it. Kind of just playing with words in a way, but it actually makes some sense. You can say, I don't like these. That consists of just a pronoun. These, in that case, is not a determiner. It's a pronoun, or that's all it is, a pronoun. And some pronouns have to go with other things and others don't. That would be part of that story. And that would be just like you then. You would be a noun phrase, consists of just a pronoun, right? It's a very simple story in a way, right? Because at some level, all we're talking about is the words that we use to associate with the kinds of things that we encounter. And we have, why do we have a word that says pronoun with noun embedded inside of the structure of that word? Because we know that those are noun-like, but we also know that they're different. So we can then we can account for lots of things. Pronoun some, I want some all by itself, or I want some candy, not all by itself. And in the case where you have a noun phrase with some candy, it would just happen to have two things that were, one or more noun is okay. One or more noun-like thing would be okay. So you would have things like you crazy people. We have these and you would both be pronouns, but you could also have the pronoun you together with other things, right? So what this does is to categorize these things together in a way that makes some sense, right? You and these and those and my and all of those things have this property of being able to go with a noun if they want. And when they go with a noun, they go in that initial slot. And they can have adjectives after them and so forth. So you then would be in the lexical entry would have, syntax would say category pronoun, and it would have an optional noun complement is the key thing here, right? Some pronouns have optional noun complements, like you, which can give us you guys, right? You people shouldn't do that. Us people, you can do it with us, right? But you can't do it with it, for example. It doesn't allow that, right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how you. This isn't a theory that I've really investigated, but there would be a constraint to the fact that every noun phrase has to have a head. None of them in and of itself is required, but the requirement that there be a head of the same kind of category as noun, right? Would that in and of itself would make noun and pronoun one of them has to show up. They can both show up, but this rule doesn't say that any of them has to show up, right? Does that make sense? It makes sense, right? Okay, so then you can account for the existence of you without anything at all as well, right? Because you is a pronoun, and in and of itself, that's enough to make a noun phrase complete. And although it can go with a noun, it doesn't have to have, right? Makes some sense, right? Okay, in the DP story, what category does you belong to? You're a DP. You have to have a D. You can have a noun phrase with you, right? So you crazy people would have to be what? DP, DU, NP, complement, right? You crazy people. So you can account for the pronouns in the DP story just as well, right? There's just a different way you can do it. Okay, so since NPs are not things in the world that you can visibly inspect, as I've already said, right? And we have to appeal to indirect evidence of different kinds. What we're looking for is, what is the account of this that makes the most sense and that gives the best overall story for what the facts are? And so therefore we go out and we find whatever facts we can to bear on that, on whatever hypothesis we choose to investigate, and we see how well it does, and we compare the different stories, and we decide on one. And in some cases, I mean, as far as I know, with this one, you could argue, like I just did, right? You can argue for either or, right? There isn't really any good empirical evidence bearing on on which one is right. And then we just have to live with that, right? Unfortunately. So that's an important thing to remember here in this class, is that I'm not going to be telling you, here's the way it is. Those are just facts. There's NPs, and I mean, sometimes I'll have to do things like that, right? But for the most part, I don't believe in much of it anyway, right? To some extent, although I can see how you can spin out different stories. I like to look at how they get spun out. I like to look at the assumptions underlying them and evaluate them. But sometimes we come up with this, right? That there are different stories that are equally fine. Which one you choose is really based on preferences that have nothing to do with the facts of language. Does that make sense? It's the way it is sometimes, right? And especially in something like this. Okay, I want to just finish here by giving for today by giving a really very brief history of syntactic theory so that we know where we're at. I don't know what this V thing here is that I have there, but don't worry about it. Well, there are V's that can be empty, right, as well. In fact, Noam Chomsky, at some point, his theory develops into one in which the notion of empty categories, empty things in the syntax, becomes critical. They start to appear everywhere. So that's something to keep in mind. But in any case, the syntactic theory, modern syntactic theory, starts out with Noam Chomsky. Probably the most important work is not syntactic structures, as I mentioned earlier, but aspects of the theory of syntax, published in 1965. So after Chomsky got some fame because of his work on, because of the book he published in 1957, Syntactic Structures, he got a job at MIT. They didn't have a linguistics department. He was hired into the Department of Philosophy. And I don't remember the exact story, but they gave him some really crappy building out there where they had foreign language teaching going on and stuff. And they said, yeah, go ahead, you can come here and do your work. And then he hired some famous people, including Morris Hawley, who was a famous phonologist. So he and Morris Hawley were there, creating theory in the 1960s. They published in 1968 The Sound Pattern of English, just this massive phonological account of English with all of these crazy complex rules all worked out in humongous, gory detail. But that was what made the theory of phonology, what propelled it along the way. And then he was there with lots of other folks working on syntax as well. So they were doing both things. And they called it a generative transformational grammar. The basic idea, if you go back, actually this goes back to Syntactic Structures in 1957. The idea is that you need phrase structure rules to characterize what happens in English, but you also need to have something that you call transformations. So transformations would say, okay, the idea was, well, build basic sentences, and then, there can be rules that just change that all around. And what can those rules do? They can delete things. So how is it that we have these things in mind, but it's not showing up in the syntax? It's because there's a rule of deletion, like that ellipsis I showed you, right? But you can also move things around. You can change the structure by virtue of the transformations. And he gave some pretty good arguments for doing it this way, and that was a key insight of that early work. So the idea here is that, well, if you have put on the hat, you can also say, put the hat on. And here, I'm using a device that I'll use a lot, probably, where I don't put, just out of laziness, I don't put the internal structure of the NP, right? So that triangle there means, yeah, you all know, you can figure that out. I'm just not going to bother to draw, because that's not what I'm focusing on. But you can have put on the hat or put the hat on. Both of those are possible, right? And they both mean the same thing, right? There's no difference in meaning between the two. So I put the hat on, I'm going to put the hat on. I want you to put your hat on. I want you to put on your hat. 6 of one, half dozen of the other, right? And so what they were observing, these people that were working on this stuff, was that there are lots of phenomena like this in languages, right? In English, there's lots of things like this, where you can have alternative orderings of things without having really a different sentence. And in most of those cases, you could find one of those that's more basic than the other. In this case, people have gone back and forth about which one of these is actually the more basic. Chomsky's original idea was that, although he didn't really spell it out very well, was that the one on the left was more basic. But anyway, there's a transformation that can take the structure at the left that's called the deep structure. So the basic idea is that, you build the deep structure, and the deep structure will have the meaning. That's where you get the meaning from. Since the meaning is in the deep structure, and we always know what the deep structure is, by virtue of our knowledge of the set of transformational rules, we can go from the surface structure to the deep structure and the meaning by virtue of our knowledge of the rules. Does that make sense? Here, in this case, it's a very simple thing, right? That you transform the surface structure by simply taking the preposition and moving it to the right. Or maybe it's the other way around in this case, who knows? But that's the basic idea. So there are transformations that can take one structure and make it into another. And our knowledge of what those transformational rules are allows us to get the meaning almost no matter what the surface structure is, depending on what the set of rules are, right? So that's, and you can see that we're still using, we're going to be using in this class structures of this kind that go back all the way, right? But we'll make them more elaborate, of course, and work out lots of details. So Chomsky's there in the late 1960s with a bunch of really smart people. Everybody was flocking there. He had lots of really smart students. Ray Jackendoff, someone who would go out and build his own version of a theory of semantics, is what he actually did. Still one of the most important people in the world of linguistics today. Published an article in the journal Language in the past year that created lots of discussion and controversy and so forth. Richard Kane, John Ross, a bunch of these people. They're working with Chomsky. They figure out in great detail all kinds of the sentences that you can make in English, the ones that are good, the ones that aren't good, all kinds of crazy, complicated sentences, and they would try them out on each other and say, hey, can I say this? And they would be imagining, well, what if the rule is that you make the transformation where you move this piece over there, and then you delete it, and then you move, all kinds of crap that they would dream up. And they would bring lots and lots of empirical evidence to bear on what they were doing. So they discover hundreds of transformations, right? Deletion transformations, movement transformations, insertion transformations, all kinds of things. And then the model is worked out for other languages. So Yuki Kuroda works it out for Japanese, student of Noam Chomsky's. Richard Kane works it out for French. David Perlmutter was student of Noam Chomsky's that was working on deletion phenomena. Was my major professor in PhD program. So they start to find all kinds of things. So here's one, sluicing. And they come up with all kinds of crazy names for all the transformations. But you can see sluicing is a deletion transformation. So this is from if you look up sluicing I just looked up sluicing to get some quick stuff from Wikipedia, and it gives me the sluicing examples. And it's, Phoebe wants to eat something, but she doesn't know what she wants to eat. Phoebe wants to eat something, but she doesn't know what. With what shouldn't go there all by itself, but it can only go there if you've already got the rest of it in mind because you've already said it, right? So there's a deletion transformation that takes that out of the picture. So we've got raising, where we have it is snowing again, then we put seems. It seems to me that it is snowing again, and you can change that into it seems to be snowing again, which has the same meaning as it seems that it's snowing again. And so you have things like that. You have a bunch of these kinds of things like what he wanted to buy was a fiat, doesn't really mean anything different than he wanted to buy a Fiat. So what do? You add a what? You move things around. You get, there's a whole slew, a family of cleft constructions that involve transformations of some kind. And then what happens is that there's a big debate about how this stuff should all be played out. Because when they started discovering all of these transformations, it was really crazy. They had, like I said, hundreds of them. And the deep structures could be very far removed from the surface structures, because there could be deletions and insertions and all kinds of things going on. And so there was a big fight. Paul Postal and David Perlmutter. Postal is just a genius, knowing more about the structure of English than probably anyone. These guys take off and devise a whole new theory that has nothing to, it keeps almost nothing from the original theory. The generative semantics people, who were accused of smoking a lot of pot, came up with the problem was that they were coming up with deep structures for sentences like Floyd broke the vase, like this, where though the meaning of that is really, I declare to you that there were its everywhere, right? So there was a it deletion rule that would, or it replacement rule, and all kinds. There was just a bunch of different transformations that they found. And what the neat thing about it is that they found empirical evidence of the same kind that you would establish that something is a noun phrase, or that this noun phrase goes in that slot. They were using just ordinary empirical evidence from what the grammaticality judgments of sentences were to build up a whole story like this. And Chomsky didn't like that because they were smoking pot. So these guys break off and develop a bunch of other theories with some other people that come into the story, and they actually develop a whole brand of linguistics that said we don't buy any of that, and they call it cognitive linguistics. But we're not going to look at that in this class, although it's interesting stuff. Roland reference grammar starts out with Robert Van Valen and a partner of his, friend of his. He was a student at UC Berkeley, wasn't in the MIT crowd. He said, that's all crazy because I'm looking at lots of different languages. He was looking at Australian languages and Native American languages. He did his dissertation on a Native American language, and he said, you know what, you would never come up with this crap if you didn't start with English. If you started with Dakota, or Lakota, I think he was working with, then you would never even dream of this kind of stuff. You would do it different. So he devises a different theory. Another student of Chomsky, the students of Chomsky start breaking off and making their own theories. Ivan Sag, a professor at Stanford, develops one. Another professor, both of these were students of Chomsky's. They developed their own theories. They saved some of the parts of it and developed other things. And then Chomsky changes his theory in a number of ways over the years, calling it different things at each of the big changes, right? So it's the standard theory as opposed to those nuts, the smoking pot, right? And then it's the extended standard theory because he makes some other big changes. And then government binding theory. And then the current version of it, I think, is still going by minimalism because it's, I don't know why it's called minimalism. But then it turns out that, and what we're going to be looking at, by the way, is something in the domain of some kind of baby version of minimalism, the current Chomsky theory, which is still considered by much of the world to be the standard theory, the mainstream theory. But then what's interesting, and you'll see as we go along that we may get to this, is that minimalism is really not much different from generative semantics, the way it developed. It has crazy big structures for little sentences and more or less, right? Okay, that's the story about that.